Welcome to The Bone, the podcast that goes deeper. Here we cut through the noise and get straight to the core of the issues that matter. From real stories to raw truths, we dive deep into the conversations that shape our world and challenge our thinking. We're not afraid to dig in and get to the marrow of it all. Whether it's life, culture, or business in sports medicine, we're here to break it down raw and real. No filters, no fluff, just to the bone. With your host, Shelby Daly, we're getting to the bone. This is a clinically pressed, approved CEU podcast. Find the quiz to gain credit at clinicallypressed.org/courses. Clinically Pressed Company, making the complicated simple through results that give back. Find out more at clinicallypressed.org. Let's get started.
Kendrick, he's in Australia, and he's the founder and inventor of dynamic tape, the original biomechanical tape designed to manage load and movement, not just provide support. With a background in physiotherapy and biomechanics, Ryan set out to solve the limitations of traditional taping methods, creating a system that works like an external muscle, absorbing load, assisting movement, and helping to restore natural function. We'll talk about how dynamic tape differs from kinesiology tape, the science behind the design, and what current research tells us about the clinical and performance outcomes. So welcome to the show, Ryan.
Thanks, Shelby. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you first became interested in physiotherapy and biomechanics?
Sure. Yeah. So my background, I guess, how I became interested, I was always involved in a lot of sport growing up. I had the misfortune when I was about 12 to have a piano fall on my leg. One of those things, it was an experiment at school. I don't think you'd be allowed to do it these days. And it was in science. It was on friction and pushes and pulling. And we had a piano, and I was, pushed one way, and then I had this rope around and I was pulling, and somebody was pushing from the other side, and the casters caught, and it, we talk a lot about physics in dynamic tape, but the angular momentum, the casters caught, and it tipped over, and fortunately it sort of hit me and knocked me out of the way and didn't just land on me, or it would have been a lot worse. But I had the state championships coming up a couple of weeks later for soccer. I grew up playing a lot of soccer and cricket in Australia, and so that put an end to that idea. But following on from that, I had a lot of physiotherapy and things like that to get back, and so that sort of probably got me interested initially in studying physiotherapy or studying sports medicine and things like that. But interestingly, after I graduated, I worked in a whole range of areas. I worked in intensive care actually for quite a while, doing a lot of respiratory physiotherapy as well. Worked in neuro rehab, did a range of different things before I went down the sports path. And then I worked probably in three main areas, I guess. So one was in that elite sport. So I worked with the professional cricket in England, actually, for a number of years. I worked on the professional with one of the tennis players, Greg Rosetsky, who was number 4 in the world, I think, at his peak, US Open finalist and so on. So I traveled with Greg after he'd had a number of injuries, and worked with him for a number of years, and with his role on the British Davis Cup team. And then just a lot of different sports through private practice. So I worked in private practice in England and in Australia, where we mainly did either chronic pain and chronic musculoskeletal, chronic sports injuries as well, or elite athletes, really, or those aspiring to be elite athletes, but also your run-of-the-mill, people. A lot of my focus was on the neck and back pain, neck and arm, back and leg type of pain as well. And then also teaching on the as a clinical tutor on the undergraduate and master's program for Griffith University, which is on the Gold Coast in Australia. So again, in their musculoskeletal component of that. So there's been a few different things. And I think in terms of the tape, or, we were sort of just trying to find solutions for our own athletes. We didn't set out to start a tape company, if you like. And my wife is also a physiotherapist, from northern Sweden, as we were talking about. And she came at it from a different perspective because she worked predominantly in pediatric neurological or even geriatric neurology. So she was looking a lot at function and, can we get these thumbs out of the palm and create a functional grasp, or somebody's walking, can we improve their gait? Those sorts of things. Where they're weak, can we assist them? Whereas I was coming at it from that sports, especially if you think of tennis and cricket and things like this, we're really looking at those sort of overload, overuse type of injuries. The last, nearly 15 years, I've worked with beach volleyball quite a lot in Vanuatu, where I live now. So it's a separate country from Australia originally. Been living in Vanuatu for a long time now. And so, again, lots of jumping and landing and hitting, those hitting, throwing type of sports. So we get the tendinopathies and all those sorts of things. And so we were looking at, or I was looking at a way to manage that load externally to take some load off them, whether it was to just get them through an event so we could then build their capacity back and so on. Or whether it was during their rehab to be able to get them loading in a controlled manner, stepping up and scaling or graduating that load with a little bit more control, but also introducing speed and these other things that you sometimes struggle in those transitions in your rehab otherwise. So, so that's sort of the short version of the background.
Yeah. Well, talking about the different experiences you've had, what was the aha moment that led you to figure out how to make this dynamic tape and create it ultimately?
Yeah, there was probably a couple of different things. We used to tape a lot using our rigid athletic tapes, and they had some, I guess, benefit in that they could provide some restriction, at least for a period of time, depending on the application and so on. But often we would sort of tape somebody up and we'd think we'd done a great job, and we'd send somebody out, back onto the tennis court or whatever, and they just go, look, it's too tight, I can't get into that position. Or if they did, basically it was just ripping off and it wasn't really doing anything. And so we sort of knew that we needed something that wasn't just a passive restriction, but actually did some work more so, but yet still allowed people to get through full range. And I'd had a similar experience when I was at university. I had stress fractures in my shins, so both of my shins, and they used to do the low dye taping and things like that. And again, I found that early on, probably before it had progressed to that level of a fracture, actually I could run and do that sort of thing. It made a massive difference immediately, but then after a little while, it wasn't as effective. So, so that was probably the big thing is just seeing the limitations, I guess, of some of these other things and not doing what we wanted. Like we were trying things like taping TheraBand to people. We were taping, we would cut up the inner tubes off bicycle tires and tape those to people to try to create this, deceleration and then this assistance back the other way. Like you mentioned earlier, to almost act like an external muscle in a sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So kinesiology tape that stretches but comes to a certain point where it doesn't stretch anymore. Can you describe how your tape is different? You talked about the elastic bands and all that, and I've seen that in the US
Sure.
a lot, of just taping a band and making an external muscle, but I'm sure your tape provides a little bit more support and is a little bit more functional.
Yeah, look, and over the years, we've developed a range of different grades of resistance and recoil depending on what we're trying to do. Some things we need it to be a bit stiffer, some things we need to get more assistance, others it's more resistance and so on. So if you compare to a kinesiology tape, they're very different. As I sort of mentioned the athletic tape. Dynamic tape is probably closer, certainly is closer in thinking in our applications to what we would do with a rigid athletic tape or your elasticon or some of those other things, rather than a kinesiology tape. We're thinking very mechanically. We're putting it on in the opposite positions, going on in a short position with tension, so it's going to create that bungee, like a bungee cord type of effect, right? So when you look at the properties, it's been designed, very differently from scratch. So we've got some force gauges that we measure and things, and we can measure the same amount of kinesiology tape with a dynamic tape, and we can be getting anything from 15 kilograms, what's that, over 30 pounds of resistance with the dynamic tape, and yet it's not even registering true range on the kinesiology tape until you hit that rigid endpoint, as you mentioned, in your kinesiology tape, and then it acts a bit like a rigid tape, but it's not really designed to do that either. They're not really strong. You can break a kinesiology tape fairly easily, so they're not designed to sort of lock things up, if you like. So I've got a little bit here. I'll just show you. So these are really high resistance. They stretch in all directions as well, so that we're not limiting range, but also there's a lot of benefits of that. It reduces tension on the skin, because obviously when we've got a lot of force in the tape, you're more likely to create blisters on the skin if you don't do it correctly. But also if we're crossing tapes, we don't want one locking down because it doesn't move sideways and reducing the effectiveness of the one underneath and all those sorts of things. So it's all geared around it. But as you can see, it's got very high resistance and very high recoil force in it, because it's not designed to lift skin, create space, or just have a sort of a neurosensory sort of mechanism. It's designed around the physics and the managing load directly or changing movement mechanically to then have all the benefits that comes with that of changing lever arms, changing where your muscle is working from a length tension perspective, or if we go around things, we get very strong compression. So a bit like a sacroiliac joint belt, we can create some force closure to stabilize. So things like our ankle sprains, our syndesmosis injuries, etc., we can get nice compression into those as well.
Okay. So you said, since I don't have it in my hands, and describing it, kind of an elasticon kinesiology tape and kind of a rubber band kind of with those.
Look, the easiest, probably the closest way to think about it is like I say, that different stiffness, but like your resistance bands, therabands, your bicycle tubes, like that'd be a stiffer version, which we do have, a bit less recoil but much higher stiffness. So for things where there's not a lot of movement occurring, like an ankle sprain, but you've got high forces involved and you really want to resist quite soon, it's no good having a tape that has to stretch a long way before it really resists. You need it to resist quite soon. But of course, with an ankle, we still want to allow full movement because or movement within normal range, because that's what allows us, A, to dissipate load. We dissipate load by moving, obviously, but also to maintain our balance strategies. We're going to invert, dorsiflex, plantarflex, etc., to control and fine-tune our balance around the ankle as well. So we don't want to lock it up. In fact, if you look at some of the research on rigid taping or rigid bracing, and you have people stand on one leg and close their eyes, they actually have to put the other foot down more frequently than when they're untaped, because they can't actually fine tune with that nice fine balance strategy that you have at your ankle. You're then more reliant on your hip strategies and your shoulder and your trunk and everything else. So there's a lot more sway and so on. So that's why we have the different levels of resistance. But as I say, a tire tube would be the stiff one, and then your TheraBand or your elastic resistance band would be the springier, more bungee-like recoil type ones.
Mm-hmm. So when you came up with this concept, there must have been a couple iterations of coming up with this exact product. How did that come together, and what did some of the prototypes kind of look like?
Yeah, that's a massive understatement. There was a lot of trial and error and a lot of, so we initially, actually going back to the aha moments or the things that really motivated it, I had a student with me who was doing one of his final placements in his final year of physiotherapy. He's actually a very well-respected physio now. His name is Brad Beer. He does a lot on bone stress injuries. He's been a high-level triathlete and so on. If anybody's looking for his courses, they're great. Staying with us, and he was again, younger than I am, and he was sort of that real go-getter, out there, make it happen sort of thing. And our initial product was called Posture Pals, and we still have this, and it was like an adhesive support that goes on your back to let you bend through and do everything, but it encourages you and assists you to straighten up all the time. And I taped somebody up with a rigid tape, in the clinic with Brad, and again, it was that same thing. They're like, "Oh, that feels great when I'm doing this," but you would actually get sore because you couldn't have a stretch and move, and you were holding yourself in this one position and so on. And I shared my idea with Brad around creating something like this, and Brad sort of said to me, "Look, if you don't do it, I will." And so that was sort of the prompt that I thought, "Oh, okay, I better do something about this." And the first iteration was actually a foam product. It was like a 3 millimeter, sort of eighth of an inch thick foam, pre-cut sort of foam shape. And this is going back to about, what would this have been, about 2006 or something like that. And so we were using that in our clinic, and a couple of others, and were using it. And then we went on a program in Australia called the New Inventors. It was a program where they used to pitch sort of 3 inventions against one another and judge them all, and people would vote in and over the following week and so on. And anyway, we won the episode, and we won the People's Choice over the following week. And we thought, oh, okay, there's actually a little bit of a market here for this. But then when we got them out to everybody, we found that, the foam didn't necessarily breathe that well. So people were in the really tropical weather like I am, it could get a bit itchy and so on. And also, they were probably a bit too restrictive for what some people wanted. They wanted to be able to do absolutely everything in it. And if they did keep pushing through it, it would sort of shear the foam off the glue, and they get left with these strips of glue on their skin, which wasn't much fun to get off. So then we went towards a fabric, and that's how we started going. We tested all sorts of fabrics that were out there, existing type of products, and there was nothing that did what we did. So then we ended up working with I guess you would say, like a textile engineer type of person to come up with a version that's similar to our original tape now. But that, again, there was several sampling stages and processes to get that to where it is. And then since then we've moved on. So we have our Eco product, which is a stiffer version that I was mentioning for, say, ankles, has a higher stiffness to it. That's made out of recycled plastic bottles. So that technology took us about probably 5 or 6 years to get right. And then we've just recently brought out our Power Band, which is similar to putting 2 layers of our original together. So higher resistance and higher recoil. So really springy. So for our tendinopathies, people with Achilles or patella tendons, running, jumping, all that sort of thing. And that we've only just released. That took us probably 12 years to get right, 10 or 12 years. So there's challenges, because when you go heavier with a fabric, you lose recoil and you lose stretch. So coming up with a solution in the way that we need it, things we infuse it with, and all of this to get adequate range of motion, but also nice, strong recoil was quite challenging. So
Yeah. So how would you define the mission of dynamic tape today? I know you've gone through a few iterations, a few different versions. How would you describe it? The best use for it? I know you have different ranges and everything, but
yeah,
how would you do that?
Hard to put in a short term. I guess in terms of what our career or what our mission is, it's really around trying to identify and develop those clinical solutions, to make our life as clinicians easier, also to obviously get the best outcomes for our patients, for our athletes, but also to overall, through our education as well, which has a very strong clinical reasoning focus. It's not about teaching people a bunch of techniques. It's about teaching people how to identify what the deficit is, and then how introducing a force with the tape may help, and developing their own techniques as much as anything. And so, really we want to elevate that level of clinical practice and assist clinicians to deliver, high quality, science-backed care for their athletes or their patients, based around optimizing movement and load, so they're not risking their performance or risking their rehab and their recovery. We get inspired by patients. We have a lot of athletes who do crazy things. We work, actually see my shirt, with the Red Bull X Alps athletes who, they do, it's about 1,300 kilometers across the Alps. And they're hiking, running up the mountains, climbing, and then paragliding between it. The winter generally takes about 7 days, up to about 12 or 13 days, I think. So it's marketed as the world's toughest adventure race. And so, we get inspired by these guys, their achievements, and even my little story earlier, but having been involved in a lot of sport, we recognize that pain and the anguish of injury and disruption and the challenges and the obstacles that people have to overcome. And then obviously the flip side is the ecstasy of achieving those relatively unachievable things. So we love being part of that journey for people. So and in terms of things, I mean, it's very varied. We have a lot, and we get great feedback, and it's not necessarily the athletes. It might be the mum who, I had one lady from South Africa quite a few years ago now email me. She had a little boy who had Erb's palsy, so brachial plexus sort of traction injury, and she said, look, we tried everything, and then as soon as they put the dynamic tape on, he could actually have this functional hand, grasp. And so she was overwhelmed by it. So just being able to immediately change function like that is really, really nice. It doesn't always have to be a cure for something, but it can change somebody's quality of life, quite dramatically. So yeah.
So you mentioned that case of the hand movement and all that. What other research have you guys done with this to validate that it actually works?
Yeah, look, and that's a great question. We tend to advise as best we can, if we know people are doing research, to ensure that they've got methodology that's robust and that they're actually aligned with what we're trying to do. It's sort of one of the problems when you have a product is anybody can get hold of it and start researching it, and you're like, what are you actually even trying to do with that? That's and it's a big issue. I mean, there was one study where they just taped from the greater trochanter down to the lateral malleolus, and we're looking at balance. I'm like, well, why do you think that's going to change? Like, what is the deficit that you're actually trying to, address, and how is introducing a force, with the tape going to do that? And whereas that was just putting two relatively random things together and seeing if there's a connection, like it was just sort of, it's not really well thought out. But we try to sort of stay relatively clear of it, in the sense that as soon as we're involved, then people think it's biased and all of those sorts of things. So it's a bit of a catch-22. But look, there's been some very good studies done. For example, one by Nikki Robertson, Angie Fear, on a bunch out of the university, Canberra University in Australia. Angie is a very big tendinopathy researcher. They looked at lateral hip pain in women, so greater trochanteric pain syndrome, what formerly would have been in the basket of sort of trochanteric bursitis, gluteal tendinopathy, all those sorts of things. And they looked at their gait and people walking, and they taped a hip abduction, extension, external rotation type of technique. And the reason being is that we know our tendons don't like particularly a combination of tensile overload, but combined with compressive overload. And so the sort of the thinking around that with that particular one is, if people are adducting, internally rotating at the hip a lot more, that increases the compressive loading over that sort of trochanteric region, and that's going to aggravate things. So they did this technique, and they did it quite well. What they did was they taped people in the shortened position to maximize that bungee effect, and then they compared that with taping in a relatively relaxed position. I wouldn't say it was a lengthened position. They still had a little bit of external rotation, so there could have been a little bit of a mechanical effect still. But basically, you had one very active technique that was going to really create strong resistance and recoil, the other one not so much. But the techniques cover the same area of skin, so you sort of account for skin contact, you account a bit for expectation because they look the same. People are, going to think they're doing the same thing. And they found that in that active group, they had much, bigger changes, both in pain, but also in things like pelvic obliquity, sway during gait, hip adduction, internal rotation moments, etc. And then there's been some others looking at similar techniques with different populations. So there was a group, Natalie Bittencourt and her co-workers out of Brazil, and they looked at elite female volleyball players, doing a similar thing, looking at frontal plane knee projection angle, or you basically a dynamic valgus at the knee. So again, hip adduction, internal rotation, and had them doing a single leg squat, and again found similar things. There was another one actually out of Sydney in Australia, and they looked at university age female athletes and running, I think it was, off the top of my head. It was presented at the Australian Physio Conference a few years ago now. And again, they showed the same thing. Only in that active group did they get the nice changes. So it's providing support that it is actually the mechanical changes that are doing. It's not just having something in contact with the skin that's creating these changes. There's quite a few studies now looking at other things, comparing rigid tapes with dynamic tape, comparing kinesiology tapes with dynamic tape for things like plantar fasciitis, for arch support, navicular drop type of things. There's some comparing kinesio, I think, with dynamic tape for acromial-humeral distance, so for people with subacromial pain issues. Again, we can argue the biomechanics and the relevance of all of that, but it showed that they had a greater increase in acromial-humeral distance with a dynamic taping technique, and so on. There's others that have showed improvements in fatigue, in lumbar extensors or in back extensors. Another one with plantar flexors showing the same sort of thing, and that corresponds with what we hear anecdotally from our athletes running. You'll tape up one calf and not the other, and at the end of the race there's sore in especially marathon runners and things like that, sore in the untaped one and not the taped one, and things like that. So we do find that it even with delayed onset muscle soreness, we find that you put it on and immediately it's not as painful because you've got something just doing a little bit of the work for you. So you're not firing off or contracting as much, and therefore stimulating those sensitized nociceptors as readily. So there's some interesting work that's been done by people.
While you were thinking about or talking about that, I was thinking of, have you done any post-surgical research for muscles that have atrophied, like after ACL? I know the quad is a big one. Have you guys done any research on that or seen any research on it?
I haven't seen anything specifically on that. There was a study out of Romania on ACL a few years ago that was presented at the football, like the soccer football medicine conference in Europe. I can't remember the exact outcome measures and that they looked at, but that was specifically on ACL. Obviously, that one on the hip. That one on the hip was also looking at ACL risk in those female volleyballers. But yeah, there's been some other post-surgical ones looking at things like post-cuff repair and looking at night pain and things like that, showing nice improvements in some of those sorts of things from memory. So there's a few things. People are still getting the challenge is people knowing what we're trying to do, how to do it correctly, the mechanisms that are proposed, and creating suitable studies around that. So,
if somebody wanted to do research on this, like a student in an athletic training program or physiotherapy program, do you guys help support students that want to do research with your tape?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, we can help them with what we know from our experience with it, what we're trying to do. All of our techniques are based on fundamental research on the pathoanatomy, pathoetiology of these conditions, and the influence of load on our tendon, of movement on load, and so on. So we can help them, to create a robust sort of methodology. We can, even do things. They can send us videos of their techniques, and we can provide feedback on that to make sure that they're actually testing out, they're not just testing out what a bit of tape on the skin does, but they are actually making genuine mechanical change that we can see and measure and so on. Because, generally with this tape, if you do it correctly, you can, the results really are immediate, they're measurable, they're observable. You will see it all straight away. If you're taping somebody's Achilles tendon, we're taping that in full plantar flexion, down the back. So as they come through, it's going to resist them dorsiflexing. It's going to spring them back into plantar flexion, right? If you finish doing your taping technique and it's still resting where it was resting beforehand, you don't have a force in there. So you can go and do all the research that you like. You're not researching how you're managing load. You're just researching what you're doing, putting a bit of decoration on, or maybe a bit of sensory input, through the skin. But that's not what we're after. So yeah, we're happy to consult with people on any of that and give them. And we, as I say, we sort of steer clear of the actual research itself and any of the analysis to maintain the neutrality of it. But we prefer people doing research that's actually researching what the product can do, because we learn from that as well. And that's what we want.
Yeah. Are there formal courses for the dynamic tape yet, or even online in person?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do both. So we've got part A, a part B, and a part C. Part C is sort of evolving at the moment, but part A, you can do online or in person, as with part B. So part A goes through a lot of what I mentioned earlier, the fundamentals on taping mechanically, all the mechanisms, some of this research, how to create genuine mechanical change, when and why you might want to use it, and so on, and a range of techniques. I think the online version is probably something like 8 hours. There's about 30-something techniques to get people started as well, as all that theory, predominantly around peripheral joints. And then part B goes into a bit more around developing your own techniques and problem solving. And we use the pelvis as a nice example of taking a body of research on pelvic girdle pain, and creating clear aims of what we would want to do, and then developing techniques around that. So we do a lot more trunk and pelvis. We also do things like some things that people may not have done, taping for mechanosensitive neural tissue. So, if you're doing all your upper limb tension tests and all those sorts of things that are provocative, then is there a way that we can come in and tape around those? We also look at what we would throw into the category of symptom modification procedures. So a lot of your gliding and rotating, things that some people may have done in the past with the Mulligan type techniques, or some of Jenny McConnell's work in the past. Now they use that term a bit around the shoulder, Jeremy Lewis and some of these others. It's basically, can we come in and do something manually to change things? And if so, can we reproduce that with the tape? And is that, sufficient to get somebody through a match or whatever, or to help them in their rehab and so on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you guys go through some of the common applications. What are some of the misconceptions or improperly applied ways that you see that people apply the tape?
I think probably the biggest one is that there's a lot of people who are very familiar with kinesiology tapes, and they probably think this stretches, so it's like kinesiology tape, and then they put it on like that. Whereas in actual fact, we're generally going on in a lot of ways in the opposite position and very different techniques, because we are, if we want to go on in that short position, like I mentioned, to create that bungee effect. And so we want to be really mechanical, whereas a lot of your traditional kinesiology tape techniques were going on in a lengthened position. So as you come back, it bunches up the skin, lifts the skin, and does all those sorts of things. So that's probably one thing, people using it more like a kinesiology tape, which I think is just not getting the best out of the tape. It's not what it was designed for. The other probably common error that people make is that, again, if we want to be mechanical, you've got to get hold of the body part that you're trying to influence. And so, if you just tape sort of across here, you'll get a lot of soft tissue movement and probably not too much resistance to the motion. But if you actually spiral around, you can really take up that soft tissue tension, get hold of that lever, and then come across the chest. So that's going to really resist you getting out and spring you back into sort of your throw or your internal rotation. So, we will cut it and pass it around things, or put a hole in it and stick it over the top to really get hold of a lever. Some things are really difficult to get hold of. Patellofemoral joint, to create a mechanical effect on some people is really hard. Their patella is small, it's tucked away, you really can't get on it. Others, you can create a bit of a slingshot around the edge with the idea of creating some resistance. Say with somebody who had dislocated or subluxed laterally previously, you might be able to create some resistance to it going laterally. Others, you just give up. You're just not going to get purchase on that patella. So that's probably the other big one. The other most common one, though, is just creating blisters and things on the skin, because the force is so much greater in this. You do need to apply it differently to account for that, and make sure you're distributing that force nicely, and not just in a focal spot on the end, or where you've turned a corner or something like that, where it creates a lot of tension, and therefore more likely to create some skin breakdown.
Yeah. So are there any scenarios where you would not recommend using dynamic tape, or contraindications?
Yeah, sure. Like, obviously people with known allergy to medical adhesives, that's a big one. People with, you do have to look at their skin integrity, frail, damaged, sunburnt skin, all those sorts of things. I would say you need to be careful, particularly with extremities, toes and things like that. People with poor sensation, peripheral neuropathy, diabetic, poor circulation, all those sorts of things. The last thing you want to do is create a blister that, turns into an ulcer and then an amputation. That's not a great outcome from your tape. So we would steer clear of some of those things. You do need to take care going circumferentially around certain things as well, because it does have such strong compression. That's why we'll often spiral on an angle, which is less likely to impact the circulation, but still gives you some compression at the joint or whatever it is. But you do need to have some care when you're doing those sorts of techniques as well.
Yeah. And then do you have any favorite performance stories where you've applied the tape and it's made a big difference? I know you talked about the kid in South Africa, but have you had any other ones?
Yeah, I think probably the ones that really resonate. There's probably a couple. I've had a couple where they've applied it to themselves, actually. But I had an email from a chap in England a number of years ago now. He was going to his daughter's wedding and he had a foot drop. And he said, look, I'm walking her down the aisle. I don't want to use an AFO and hobble down the aisle. Is there anything that we can do? And so we showed him how to tape for dorsiflexion, to resist his foot flopping down, to stabilize his ankle a little bit more, and so on. And so that allowed him to do that without the AFO. So again, for him, that's been huge. He may never use the tape again, but for him, that was his goal, and that was, made a big impact for him. So I think people often think, and especially when you're talking about research and looking at it, they'll go, regardless, not just tape, but everybody was the same at 4 weeks, therefore it didn't do anything. It's like, well, hang on a second, let's go back. In clinical practice, it always comes down to what is the patient's aims and goals. It doesn't have to be curative necessarily to be clinically indicated and beneficial. And so for that fellow, that was a massive thing for him. And he may use it when he goes out walking on uneven ground or whatever else, who knows. But that was big. Another one from the UK actually was a fellow who's still in contact with me. He comes to mind because he emailed me only recently. He had nerve injury, and so he had poor plantar flexion force, and he's a keen mountain biker. And so as he would go over the bumps, his ankle would jam up into dorsiflexion, and he would give him this anterior sort of talocrural joint pain and ankle pain. And so we worked with him on some ideas with the tape. And so he does quite a strong one with the Eco, which is quite resistive as well as the original, to create that plantar flexion force. But then he also uses a rigid tape through the front of the talus and around the calcaneum. So basically, as he goes into dorsiflexion, it's almost creating a bit of a posterior gliding force on that talocrural joint. And he finds that works really, really well for him. So that's great. But then I love seeing it, not ones that I've been personally involved in, but, see it on the TV. Last week or a couple of weeks ago, we had the Whitman's tennis final finals in Saudi Arabia for the year, and Elena Rybakina, who won, had dynamic tape on her shoulder. I think it was, from memory, was doing like a decelerating her and follow through type of a technique. On the same weekend, Novak Djokovic won a tournament and tore his shirt off, and he had our eco across his back. So, those sorts of things is like you sit there watching it and see it on the TV. So that always gives you a bit of a thrill to know that, we started on a very small island in the South Pacific, and now you're seeing it on all these guys. My personal favorite, being a big surfer, a friend of mine said he paddled past Kelly Slater at the Superbank, which is a famous break in Australia, and he had dynamic tape on. So it's not an endorsement. None of those are endorsements, but just saying, they're the things that me personally gives me a bit of a thrill when you see that. And then also, I've been fortunate with our Vanuatu beach volleyball team to be involved with them at 2 Commonwealth Games where they've won bronze medals at both. And one of the girls had come down heavily on fairly impacted sand, about 10 days out. And every time she trained, her knee would just blow up. And we were able to tape her up to do some work at the quads and just to support that knee. And it just went down. And so she was very appreciative. She used that throughout the games. And then on the last one, it was, again, that decelerating and follow-through type of activity or technique when they're doing that sort of activity to manage that load in her shoulder. And that got her through as well. So that's always nice.
Well, it's always cool to see your product out in the wild and people using it.
Absolutely. Yeah, we still get, you still pinch yourself sometimes, as I say, we started off just, really sort of solving our own problems, and then we showed it to a few others and they're like, oh, you really need to do something with this. And then, here we are 15 years later or more, seeing it on from the, we saw it at the Super Bowl, for example. It was on one of the players at the Super Bowl this year. See it in the Premier League football, in the World Cup football, all the time, all those sorts of things. So it's it's great.
Yeah. So you're 15 years in. Are there any new products out that are going to come out soon, or are you guys pretty happy with what you have to offer?
Yeah, look, as I mentioned earlier, it's a long process bringing out new products. It's never as easy as you think it's going to be. You have a great idea. The idea is the easy part, getting the manufacturing, and then, as I say, even with ours, getting the education and the, having people understand that it's not those other things. It's not a kinesiology tape. It's not an athletic tape. It should be used very differently. That's all challenging. But, we're always on the lookout for solutions. We brought out our scissors, for example, which are quite different, just because we weren't happy with what we had. So our scissors have got I've actually got a pair somewhere to show you. So they're sort of, sorry to do the advertising, but you've got this blunt nose and the long blade, so you can sort of cut through tape, but then also these nice finger loops, because if you use your traditional Lister scissors and things, often cutting under rigid tapes, you really get a lot of pressure on your finger. Most of your taping scissors that are Teflon coated, so non-stick, don't have a blunt nose, so you can't get under. They're very sharp, and you can't get under other tapes and things like that. So we just wanted something for ourselves, and that's what we created. So they're fun as well. But at the moment, I think we're having a little bit of a rest from the new things, and we'll work on spreading the word about the existing ones more, and hopefully get more and more people understanding where it fits in, where it doesn't fit in, where you would use this tape, where you would use something else. And then then we'll see what evolves from that.
Yeah. So for anybody that hasn't used dynamic tape before, or don't even know what it is at this point, what would be a message that you want to get out to them about why this is an important thing to play with and get used to and possibly utilize in their practice?
Yeah. Look, I think it's just a natural extension of your management anyway, and your clinical reasoning anyway. We're already looking at people and how we can manage load. We look at their equipment, we look at their training programs and their scheduling, we look at how they're moving, we look at the environment. We take people off the hills and we put them on flats, or we put them in the water where we can get some weight relief or whatever. We're already doing all of these things. And this is a natural extension, but it allows us to keep people moving. And I think that's really important, is that we know that we get far better outcomes if our athletes or our patients are key, drivers of their rehab, if you like, if they're in control. We know that those who come in and passively sort of throw their hands up and say, fix me, they tend not to do as well as the ones who come in and say, okay, what do I do? How do I fix myself? And there's lots of research on that. We know we want people to be moving, and we know we want them to be really engaged in their rehab. And I think, if you think of something like plantar fasciitis or something like that, what do you do when normal load is too much? Just getting up in the morning, just walking on it is really painful, keeps irritating it. What options do we have? Do we put somebody non-weight bearing? Do we put them in a walking boot? What are these options? None of those are particularly functional. None of them are particularly popular with the patient or the athlete. But if we can come in and do something externally that takes some load off them, allows them to continue to walk normally, hopefully walk better without compensation, because now we've got some load being taken up, then I think that's a really valuable part of our rehab, in terms also of preventing people going on to chronicity. This is obviously just my opinion, but if people can see that you can change pain immediately, they're less likely to be as fearful of movement and catastrophize some of these things and think that they're never going to be rid of it, and all of those things that can, from a psychosocial perspective, move people along a pathway to more persistent pain. So I think there's lots of benefits. And I guess probably the simple way of thinking about it, the name dynamic tape came from a dynamic splint, where you've got, say, somebody who's had flexor tendon surgery and they've got the splint on with the rubber bands coming down through here, so they can use the intact extensors to stretch and move through range to give it a bit of movement and stretch, but then the rubber bands pull the fingers back and do the work to protect that operated tendon. And this is sort of the same idea, is that can we do the work externally where somebody is like that, they're injured, and we want to protect it for a period of time, or if they're weak, can we assist them? It may be like you mentioned with the ACLs and their quads, where they're landing, and as a result of not being able to control in that sagittal plane because their quads are weak, they're collapsing into the transverse or the frontal plane. Can we come in and reinforce and create a big spring basically across the front of their knee, so when they land, they've now got something else resisting them collapsing into flexion and assisting them to come back up. So the force from that combined with their quads is enough to overcome the force of gravity and the weight of their body, so they can control that movement, they don't collapse into those other planes. So I guess the simple message is, we can always benefit, I think, from managing load, managing movement, changing people's function. It's a natural extension of your clinical reasoning. You're probably already trying to do it with other things and you haven't really had the tools to do it. And it really does, I think, help with those other aspects, our exercise-based interventions, even some of your manual therapy to some extent as well. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, if somebody wanted to learn more about dynamic tape, where would you point them to?
Look, there's a number of resources. Obviously, they can reach out to us through the website. The website does have some videos that are freely available. If you register as a clinician on our website, which is free to do, that opens up a whole lot more videos. Our YouTube channel has quite a lot on it, and we're working at sort of increasing the number of videos on there that are publicly available, and just tidying that up at the moment. The other thing on our website, of course, are the more structured courses. As I mentioned, the Part A, Part B courses. There are live face-to-face courses running, and we have some great, highly experienced educators who are teaching those. And then we also have the online version, which is available on there as well. So people can get in and do that in their own time. And when I say online, it's delivered online. You can do it in your own time, but taping is, we want to make sure that when people are doing it, they're not just going through it and not getting much out of it. So it's interactive. So you basically would send videos into us. Generally, it's me. I'll draw all over it, provide feedback, give a voiceover, and send it back to you. So you actually are getting some feedback on your techniques to make sure that you, again, as I say, you're not just sticking some tape on skin. You are actually changing things mechanically, which is going to give you those better outcomes.
Nice. Well, that's exciting.
Yeah.
I'll have to look into this a little bit more.
Yeah, let me know and I'll sort you out.
Perfect. Well, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on. I know the time difference from Australia to Alaska was quite a thing, but I'm glad we were able to meet up.
Yeah, no, look, it's fantastic. And again, hopefully the internet's behaved itself and the dogs were not too much of a distraction for people on the recording. But yeah, appreciate your time.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much.
Great.
That's it for today's episode of To the Bone. I hope we've sparked some new thoughts, challenged your perspectives, or simply reminded you to dig a little deeper. Remember, life isn't just about what's on the surface. Sometimes you've got to cut deeper and get to the bone of what really matters. To the Bone podcast is a product of Daily LLC. It's hosted and produced by Shelby Daly, ATC, and Randy Daly. No clinical decision-making should be based solely on one source. While care is taken to ensure accuracy, factual errors can be present. For more on the show, visit www.tothebonepodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Get involved in the conversation. You can find us at www.tothebonepodcast.com. Drop us topic suggestions or be a potential guest. We're all about connecting with you, our listeners. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and